Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. My name is Ibrahim Aoude. Immigrants, we have two guests today, and they'll be talking about the immigration issue in the United States, in Hawaii at the UH. Eréndira Aldana, she is a PhD candidate in psychology at the UHM and also a member of UH Immigrant and Refugee Action Coalition. And also we have Clare Hanusz. She is an immigrant attorney. So welcome to you both. And we shall start with saying, how did you come to be interested in this kind of topic? We start with Eréndira.
I have been part of a mixed status family since I've been part of a family.
Yeah.
And so originally my experiences start in that realm, really living the immigrant experience from my own perspective and seeing how, depending on the status of each individual in our family, our futures were impacted and maybe played out in certain ways. And so when I went to college, I was really involved in the undocumented student movement in Southern California for many, many years in community organizing. And then I came here to do my PhD program. I decided to become the president of a club here, La Raza Unida, where one of our goals was to create a safe space for the Spanish-speaking student community on island, part of UH. And then we faced this new administration. And then the students in my group and the students that I am a part of, this community, a lot of us started feeling a lot of fear, a lot of concern for what was happening in our communities back home, and a lot of concern about the discourse of what people were saying about our communities here on island. And so because of that, I was able to get with a great group of people to form the UH Immigrant Refugee Action Coalition.
Very good. And we shall detail these things later on. But Clare, welcome again to the show.
Thank you. It's always good to be here.
So how did you become involved?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Ohio, and my parents always had a strong interest and were active in different social justice issues. And when I went to university, Ohio University, I became very interested in Latin American studies, and this was at a time when the United States was very actively engaged in wars in Central America. And so there were many refugees coming up through Central America who were, of course, not viewed as refugees by the government because it was the U.S. government that was creating the situations that drove them out of their countries in the first place. It's simplifying it, but I think it's pretty spot on. So just hearing people's stories really, and thinking about, always being interested in politics, the way governments work, the way social movements work, kind of started piquing my interest. And then I moved to Arizona and worked for a small nonprofit that worked with Central American refugees, and started actually out of the sanctuary movement in the early 80s, when I was too young to even know what that was at the time, and met a lot of immigration attorneys who were doing really phenomenal work. And at that point, I was done with my undergraduate degree. I was thinking about a master's in social work, or Arizona State had a program called Justice Studies, and maybe a PhD, maybe teaching. But I realized that immigration law really packaged all of my interests better than any other profession. Social justice, human rights, politics, international relations, all those things came together under the umbrella of immigration law. So my husband finished his PhD at ASU. He came to Manoa, where he teaches in political science, and I went to law school here and graduated in '99, and had the experience when I was a law student to go back to Arizona and work for a nonprofit for a summer out of an immigration detention center and actually take a case all the way through. And again, that just kind of confirmed what I wanted to do and where I wanted to, what I wanted to spend my life doing, a big part of my life doing. So I'm balancing that with being a mom and public schools are also a big passion of mine, so I'm doing a lot of public school advocacy as well. But immigration's really important, so I've been just fortunate to have a profession that's also something that I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
And it brings me to meet wonderful people like Eréndira, other people at UH and throughout the community who are doing really, really good work. So that's kind of the bonus for doing this.
And your husband is an immigrant as well.
He is. He is, right. Actually, that's I think part of why he's always been so supportive of what I do. He's from Turkey. He went through the process of getting permanent residency after we got married, and then citizenship once we moved to Hawaii. He's half Kurdish, so he's an ethnic and also a religious minority from Turkey. And so, so some of his struggles and hardship with his relationship with his country, I see very much in the situations of my clients. And I think that, although I'll never claim to know what it's like to really walk in their shoes, because my circumstance has been very, very different, I think it does help me with the empathy factor, which I think is really missing in the United States right now, and is part of, I know we'll get to this later, but I think that's part of what has gotten us to this point today, is the lack of ability to hear and listen to people's stories and to see, well, if that had been me, how would I want to be treated?
Like also, like, there's a difference between sympathy and empathy, and the empathy is very important. In your case, you're also fighting in your own interests, you know, it's even beyond the empathy part, So could you tell us something more about things you do, and perhaps by way of example as well, in terms of your experiences?
A lot of the work that I started doing in this field in California really was about the empathy that we're talking about. And so I was part of a group, a student club of mostly undocumented students, and I was not undocumented, so I was considered an ally. So what I did was I traveled, this was in the Long Beach, Los Angeles metropolitan area. I would spend every single weekend and many days after the school day traveling to the local public schools in the area, talking to counselors, typically high school counselors, about how to help them address the issues that undocumented students would face if they were trying to get to higher education. And a lot of times, these counselors would bring parents in. And so it was not only about having students and counselors in public school systems navigate the higher education system, it was also parents trying to navigate a bunch of different issues in their community. And these were issues that I had faced in my own community growing up. I'm very fortunate to, Spanish is my first language, and I practice it very, very often, and I'm very, very immersed in the culture, and so I was able to interact with families in this way. But this was really the focus, trying to educate families that had students that were undocumented, that were, in almost every single case, the first in their family to want to go to college. What would that process look like? And when they got to our university, there was the support network of students where we would help each other out. The other thing, though, was really trying to educate other high school counselors that maybe weren't so aware of these issues, why it was important to think about these issues, and what are appropriate ways to address them and not address them in terms of creating safe community environments and safe school environments. And so I think a lot of that has translated to what we're doing now here at UH, really changing the discourse about how we address these issues and how that relates to creating safe communities for all, right? We want everyone to feel safe within these spaces. And immigration is an issue where a lot of us don't feel safe because of where we are, documented or not. But also, even though I am documented, there are times when I don't feel safe within a space, and I can tell based on the language that other people use to talk about the immigrant issue.
Yeah, no, that's very important. When Claire, you were talking about like you're also interested in schools, high schools, and all of that. What triggered something in me that's saying that, well, undocumented can be in those schools, etc. I don't know if you had like some of these kinds of experiences with helping undocumented or fighting for undocumented workers in high schools. So, okay, I'll stop here to answer before I go ahead.
Most of the kids, students I've worked with, actually, I've gotten to know them because they actually had status. They were born in the United States, but their parents were not.
Okay.
So if say the parent was in deportation proceedings and we could make a case based on hardship to the children, I would have to get to know those families really, really well. It was very, very intimate, the level of detail I needed to know about them so that I could help them present their story to a judge. There are, though, undocumented students in Hawaii. There are quite a few people who are undocumented in Hawaii, and I always say that when we think about undocumented, it's usually two distinct groups that we're talking about. One is people who entered the United States without status, who crossed the border illegally into the United States. And then there's another group of people who had legal entries into the United States as students or visitors or lots of different, some maybe employment-based visa, and then they overstayed their visa. Or people who came from, there are 38 countries that allow what's called a visa waiver, and those are usually more affluent countries where there's a lower number of people who are likely to overstay. And those people come under visa waiver. They're supposed to leave after 90 days, and for lots of different reasons. And it's kind of person by person by person. You have to look at why are the reasons that people stayed and why are the reasons that they didn't leave. So in Hawaii, and again, many people don't realize that we have lots of people. And it's not like you walk, skin color and ethnicities, we see that. People don't have bubbles over their heads saying what their immigration status is. And there are people who pass as documented for years and years and years, decades. And it's a difficult existence for them, but they all have good reasons for making those initial choices or decisions. Sometimes they weren't even much in the way of choice. And so there are kids in our schools who are undocumented, who came usually in Hawaii, because we're so far from the Mexican border, we don't have really much. I say that, but then I was going to say we don't have much of a population of undocumented kids. But I actually just got a call last week from a family on Maui, and both the parents are undocumented, and there are 3 kids who are, the oldest one is maybe 14, and none of the kids have lawful status. So they're here. And there are also people who came with their parents as tourists, and they overstayed. But we don't have a kind of a critical mass so that I think people are a little bit more comfortable about coming forward and talking about it. We don't have the Latino or Hispanic community in Hawaii. It's relatively small and scattered geographically, and so there have been really strong student movements led by people who have just kind of fed up, and they're ready to come forward and take to the streets and proclaim that they are undocumented. We don't have that. We don't have that in Hawaii.
Yeah, we have a significant number, but they're spread out, maybe concentrated, say, on Maui more than maybe other places.
Yeah, areas of Maui, areas on the Big Island.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that was one of the things I wanted to ask, to show that, in fact, immigrants, are related to all kinds of, activities that we have, whether it's work, whether it's schools, whether it is like, trying to go to hospital, and then they're afraid to go to the hospital because they are undocumented, etc. So these are all kinds of problems. But the other thing, and also you mentioned something about when you talked about your experiences with Latin America, because a lot of Latin American peoples came over here because of U.S. actions in there. So I sometimes ask students, like, why do we have Vietnamese here, in the United States? Well, obviously, because the United States went in there, just like, the French. Why do we have a lot of North Africans in France? Well,
Right.
for obvious
Right.
reasons,
Right.
So this is a very important thing. So if you want to look at the history of things, to try and educate the American public, there are two kind of narratives, more than that maybe, but two general things. One is the, let's say, the Trump or Obama narrative or whatever, which is, you have to have legal status and you got to stand in line and, wait for 10 years before maybe you can get it.
Right.
Or that, well, I mean, there are reasons why the people come here, because maybe transnational corporations like went to Mexico and got agribusiness and wiped out agribusiness.
Right.
And these people, what they're gonna do? Roll over and die or come?
There are strong factors that push people from their
So could you
homelands.
say something about these matters? I mean, from your experiences with some families or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there have historically always been push factors, and I think when you talked about, talking to your students, it's obvious to us. I hope, and I fear that with the newer generations coming up, that there's a lot of history that they're not learning, and so I'm glad that they have the opportunity to be in a class like yours where they are educated as to why these waves and groups of people came, and to also think about how they've enriched our lives. I mean, can you think of Honolulu without fa? I mean, it's become part of the fabric of. Right. But 40 years ago, it wasn't so much of the fabric. But how these groups come and they contribute and they make our cultures more more rich. But there are still absolutely factors that are pushing people from their homes. Now, a lot of the factors globally, say pushing people from the big spots in the world where there are large groups of people who are being forced to flee, such as in the Middle East and parts of Africa, and even parts of Asia. We don't see so much directly, and this was part of the Trump's kind of his refugee ban and the Muslim ban, and then we looked at how many refugee families were resettled in Hawaii, a relatively small number, and for reasons such as you want to resettle a family in a community where they have people who are from similar places, so that to help them assimilate in. But locally we have among Hispanics, many Asians, you ask people why did they come, and they're fleeing desperately violent situations. I have clients now I'm working with from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, who are just very, very, very dangerous situations.
Oh, yeah.
So they're fleeing for their own lives, and they're fleeing for the lives of their children. There's also economic violence, right? If you cannot afford to feed your family, and if you cannot see a future for your children, I think if we can all just imagine if that was us, what would we do? So I don't see these people as just rule breakers. I see them as actually being very brave for taking these huge risks to make a better life for themselves and their kids. And I wondered if I would have the same courage, actually, if I had been born into that circumstance. So we hear things now in the news about there are fewer numbers of people who are trying to cross the border. And I hope that doesn't make us think that, well, everything's getting better, because it's not. What's happening is that the United States has always spent a lot of money working with Mexico to keep Central Americans from even reaching the U.S. border, where they could seek asylum. And there's more and more money going into that. So I remember this graphic from a brochure in the 80s that had a hand from the United States with a kind of Uncle Sam hat, going down through Mexico and right at the Guatemalan border, and keeping the people out. So it's not as though things are better. It's not as though people don't have really strong reasons for fleeing. It's that the United States is trying very hard to keep them away. And some of the other policies that have been proposed under Trump are, I mean, they're twisted and cruel, such as well as a deterrent for women and children coming up. We'll keep mothers here and we'll keep kids here. Literally separate them into different detention centers as a way of de-incentivizing their coming to the United States. I mean, any parent,
cruel
you don't have
and
to be
unusual
a parent,
punishment.
on top of the hell that these people have already endured, it's and that's again where the complete lack of empathy or ability to think, if that had been me, what would I want? It's shocking, and it really shows how our leaders are in these very scary little privileged bubbles, and it's very hard to break through that.
So, Eréndira, you worked for the longest time, like in southern LA and all of that. So obviously it was under Obama.
It was. We were still working.
Yeah. So could you say a little bit more about your experiences and the Obama actions regarding immigration? What happened? Like we all hear about the dream thing, and I personally I have a lot of reservations about it. But anyway. So the dream thing, Obama was very good, but what did he actually do, given your experience?
So when I was in college, a lot of us were working to support the DREAM Act. That would have been a path to naturalization for my friends at the time. So we were doing a lot of risky things in order to call attention to the issue. And then we were fighting and fighting and fighting, and then the day came and it didn't pass. And a lot of this time leading up to this, a lot of my friends and us were having this discussion about how we thought it wasn't enough, how maybe now I can become naturalized because I'm a university student, but what about my parents? And what about my grandparents? And so it was still very much in the front of our minds and in our hearts that families can still be separated. And so that is where we did a lot of work to just try to secure our communities in and of ourselves, in this idea that, well, we cannot depend on a reform from this president at this time. A DREAM Act would be nice. It would make some of our lives easier, but our families still have this fear. And at any time, our parents can still be taken away from us. And so what can we do in terms of sharing social capital and resources about keeping each other safe? And we spent a lot of time doing that at Long Beach. Now the game is different because now there are even more threats, and it's a little bit more complicated and complex. But even back then, it wasn't necessarily an ideal sort of circumstance.
Sure. Because it also had like something to do with military, a military component to it in terms of, not in all cases, but if you like to go into the military and serve, then, it would be better. But I hear all kinds of horrible stories about people who have been waiting for like a few years now, who had like, volunteered as immigrants into the military, and now they are waiting, and they don't know what is going on. So, I mean, that is also a problem. Another problem is that the Democratic Party itself was pushing for the DREAM Act, right? Which tells me something, given the politics of the Democratic Party in Latin America and elsewhere, so that's another problem.
So initially, during the first Obama campaign, and this was something too that that had been pushed for under Bush as well as comprehensive immigration reform, right? So a plan that would have a border component, but would also give a pathway to permanent residence and then naturalization. And even so, naturalization is when you get your U.S. citizenship. But even under the DREAM Act, it would have been permanent resident. There's no immediate citizenship. It's 5 years of permanent residency. It's a path, right? It's an opening where no path now. where no path has existed for a long time.
Right.
There was a program that sunsetted or closed in 2001 that allowed for immediate family members, say if they had entered the country illegally, but they had a way of getting a green card through a family member. They could pay a $1,000 fine and continue the process without. Now the way it works is you have to leave the country, and then when you leave the country, you generally trigger a 10-year reentry bar because of the time that you were unlawful in the United States for that period of time. Which is why people don't leave, to do it that way, because it's just too risky. You're not going to, if you leave, you may never
come back.
You may never come back. So that program, it was called 245I, was kind of a win-win. The government got a lot of money, and people got to stay with their families, and that was all good. So there had been, Obama talked a lot about comprehensive immigration reform. There was a surge of Latino voters for Obama, and a lot of hope that within. I mean, this was one of his major promises, and then I think he had a window of opportunity, and he didn't take it, and then that window closed, and then so the DREAM Act was kind of a scrap. Kind of throwing the movement a bone, but it would have benefited. It would have had significant benefits for lots of people. I agree. I didn't like there was a component that if you did military service, I mean, you had to have graduated from high school. There were still a lot of hoops that people had to jump through, but again, it was kind of better than nothing, which is what and that didn't even pass. So then we have DACA, which is deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is for people who came to the United States as children, no fault of their own, and had clean records, and still a bunch of boxes you had to check and documents you had to provide. And it didn't even give a path to permanent residency. It was just, I think of it as really kind of a temporary bubble of protection. It's not a status, but it means that you are not an enforcement priority. So you can come out of the shadows. You can apply for a driver's license. You can apply for work authorization, which you pay for. It's over $400 a year now to get that.
You're living on the margin.
Completely on the margin, but a little less on the margin than you were before. Okay, but it was a risk because you're giving the government all of your information, and so people had some concerns about that. Under Obama, it seemed like it was a pretty safe risk. Now under Trump, of course, people who've applied for it are very nervous about, because a lot of people in the Trump has said kind of mixed things about DACA. Generally people with DACA, he's said, are safe, but there are a lot of people, including Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, Bannon, the people behind him, who have talked about repealing DACA, which would leave all those people completely exposed and subject to, most of them subject to deportation. So we went from a period where there was some hope to kind of no hope, and now it's like worse than that. I don't even know how to describe what we're in now. Now it's resistance and fighting. Resistance and fighting. Actually, that's where we are now. No one's putting any efforts into anything positive because it's not going to happen. It's all about how do we organize to keep things from getting worse.
Good. So Eréndira, knowing all of this and your experience, etc., you look at the United States government of the United States and also society, because you have a lot of racist people that have said all kinds of racist things, even in Hawaii, about immigrants, etc. Not only about immigrants, but anyway, about blacks and all of that. So, you're a PhD candidate, and you do this kind of work. So why do you think these things are happening? I mean, beyond, the
million-dollar question.
From your own, why? This is important because to figure out ways of combating it. If we don't know why, then how are we going to combat it, you see? So that's why I ask it.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things that I've changed since the work that I've been doing in California and the way that I have these conversations here is really trying to get people to understand that the issue of immigration does not lie solely with my community. So for the most part, the rhetoric is an immigrant issue is a Mexican issue, and there's this border, and we want to stop people from crossing this border. And so one of the things that I really try to get people to look at in a different way is the idea of that this border is imaginary, and it moves, and it has moved across time, and has very many different variations. And so if you look at me, and this is a conversation in California is different than the conversation here, but in Cali, the conversation would be, between you and I'm the one that's indigenous to this continent, right, since the beginning of time. Your ancestors are not from this landmass. If you call this continent your home now, I'm not going to turn to you and say, you crossed an imaginary border. So maybe let's think about this in a different way. I am indigenous to the continent of North America. How many of us that are Americans can claim that? And so don't invade my land. I could also ask you the same, but I don't. Because I'm about creating safe community that's inclusive for all.
Yeah, so that's the difference. I mean, you know, a lot of racism and all of that, you know, if you look at American history, recent American history, which is not too old by itself, like what, 240 years or something like that. But anyway, but just recent one, it's like problematical, right? So that's one thing. But why this or those racist narratives? I mean, there must be something. I want to mobilize some people to do certain things for me, you know, as an elite and so forth. So, I mean, it is important because a lot of Americans, you know, whether they are Caucasian or even blacks who, or even Chicanos and, you know, immigrants who figured, hey, you know, can't beat them, so join them, you know, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So they look at other immigrants who came like now instead of 20 years ago, and then there's like this kind of tension among them, etc. So for me as an elite, I want to mobilize people in a way that have them be a social basis for me against, like, you know, immigration and immigrants in general. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, this idea of creating an in-group and creating an out-group is very a natural tendency in human behavior. And so that's something that we as individuals and we as a part of society have to be really conscious about combating, because naturally humans have this tendency of us versus them. So the way that it becomes a problem here is that the us versus them narrative within our communities really is within the context of a capitalist society that is the result of many years and different forms of colonization, where the us only got to be the us because of power and domination and violence against the majority of the others. And so I think it's very easy to fall into that narrative of, well, I am an elite, or if I'm not an elite, I'm going to repeat this rhetoric because I believe that one day I can be an elite. So this narrative of the American dream, if I work hard enough, I can make it to the top. I think that's one of the things that we see when a lot of other marginalized communities attack my own community as an immigrant, even though your community and my community are oppressed in the same ways by very similar mechanisms of power. You fail to see that because you would like to believe that if you work hard enough, you will make it to the top. And facing the reality is very, very harsh.
Yeah, like this upward mobility kind of thing. But the other problem, and you know, we haven't yet, we touched upon them, but we haven't yet talked about like the current legal immigration laws here. I mean, you know, in general, but it would be good to talk about them in light of what I'm just gonna pose, which is, you know, globalization occurs, capitalist globalization, people losing jobs, this, that, and the other, the Rust Belt, blah, 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 etc. And then I, as the elite, gonna blame someone, especially after the 2008 crash, you know, the global and financial crisis. And so I'm going to blame you, an immigrant, even if you were here like 30 years ago or whatever. Or these guys who come across the border, this, that, and the other, or the guys who come from the Philippines, you know, all of that. So I'm going to blame these guys to say to the people, especially Caucasians and, you know, some blacks and some Chicanos, etc. Hey, these guys has nothing to do with the capitalist system or whatever. So,
but can I say, I think that the elites that are blaming don't really, of course, believe that, right?
Of course,
it's just,
absolutely.
It's a great story. It's easy, and when you're, I think if everybody or if more people were doing really well, immigration wouldn't be so much of an issue. But we need a group to blame. Right, and people are really struggling. Many people are really struggling in the United States across color lines, and it makes when you're facing those kind of challenges, and part of people struggling is, I mean, the education system has kind of gone to crap in a lot of places. So people aren't being taught to think critically from the beginning. People don't see themselves as having opportunities, and it's just it's easier to blame you know, the Mexican farm worker or the person who's standing on the corner outside of Home Depot who's really hustling than to look at the overall system. And so the elites completely have taken have advantage of that. Very successfully.
As they have done, like, you know, with African Americans, right? I mean, black, white. So we know that struggle. But also they divide the communities. I mean, especially after the Civil War, and continues on with Jim Crow later on. And then the 50s and the 60s, and then you find like white guys voting for Trump because and the blacks and the immigrants and the Mexicans taking our jobs, and you know, look, and even women rights versus men rights. Men say, mostly Caucasian, the women, look at this. What about men's rights? So they create all kinds of divisions. The elite, you know, of course, they most of them might not believe in it, but because it is important for them to protect their own global capitalist interests.
And of course, this is not just at all unique to the United States, right? This is a global phenomenon.
It's in Germany.
Absolutely, Australia. I saw
Australia. I can tell you horror stories about Australia. Well, you lived in Australia.
I lived there for a bit, and so it's so we're on a really bad and scary path internationally. And there is international resistance, and so talking about resistance and what's happening locally to fight back against these things, of course. So just in the immigration context, Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, and then on January 25th had 2 immigration executive orders proclaimed. We kind of forget about those a little bit because the one on the 27th, which was, you know, the Muslim ban, has gotten, and deservedly so, lots and lots of attention. But the 2 that came out on the 25th were really bad too. And so one is all about border enhanced enforcement of the border, and then the other is mostly concerned with interior immigration enforcement. And this is where things like sanctuary cities are being targeted, and where Obama had at least laid out priorities as far as immigration enforcement, recognizing that if there are 11 million people who are out of status in the United States, you can't deport all of them. It's just not practical. So who do we focus on? Okay, so we focus on people who have serious criminal histories. That was kind of top of the list. And then there was this group of people that if they weren't on the priority list and they got picked up, we as immigration attorneys and advocates could make the argument that, look, this isn't a priority. These people aren't a priority. So a lot of those people, because they're still caught up in the system, would be put on orders of supervision. And these were people who generally had some equities, such as children who were born in the United States who they needed to support. now all of those priority lines are gone. I think, of course, there will always be the main priority of people who have serious criminal convictions, but it's basically open season on anybody now, and so locally, it's actually been, I think, super encouraging. The numbers of people who've come forward, who've come to me, who are coming into meetings saying, what can I do? What can I do? This is so wrong. This is so unfair. I have to do something. So there's kind of this there's the old wave of people who are always on the forefront doing what they do, but there's a whole new group from UH and other parts of the community who I've never seen before, who are right there on the front lines. And
I was just gonna interject by saying, like, my department is very active in those kinds of issues.
Absolutely.
And not only my department, but my department has taken the lead in many ways. So it's good that these things happening in the context of the immigration law. So could you say something about the immigration law currently? I mean, just like outline, and then we can talk more about, immigration law beyond what we have talked about. But then after that, we can talk about specific things happening in Hawaii right now and the resistance to Trump in this case, because this is important.
So the immigration law actually remains the same. Nothing, right? Congress makes the laws, passes the laws. So thankfully, it's not so easy for President Trump to just come in and change the laws. But these executive orders have bite, and they set the agenda, they set the focus. But they're also subject to legal challenges, right? Thankfully, I mean, this is where, for all the faults of the United States, there's still. We have to fight like hell to keep the system in place, but there's still a system in place of checks and balances. And so, for example, the Muslim ban 1.0 and 2.0, the most recent challenge. I mean, Hawaii was at the forefront of the legal challenge. It's actually scheduled to be heard in the Ninth Circuit on I believe it's May 13th. It's a date for oral argument. The state has been successful so far at blocking that law, and that's why, of course, there was all the news about that judge off in that little island, Pacific Island, and it really had a huge impact, a very important impact, nationwide and worldwide, of course, as far as refugees are still able to come in. Although Trump can lower the numbers, so there are things that are very real that he can do on his own. Things such as threatening to withdraw federal funds from cities and municipalities who are refusing to either kind of have their own workers deputized as immigration agents, or to be a part of enforcing immigration laws, which is not the job of state or local municipalities. That's clearly a federal mandate, and there are far more jurisdictions that have come out against going hand in hand with that than have said we will partner with the federal government and become little immigration agents. And so in Hawaii, we had a city council resolution that was passed. There's a resolution pending in the Senate, and they're very important as far as legal biter or force, maybe not so much, but as far as a statement of intention and something that we can point to, because we have had instances in the past where local law enforcement, especially on Maui, and it's documented, Maui PD and ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents colluded to set up roadblocks that were deemed to be DUI checkpoints, which we're all against.
The ACLU put an end to that. So then I worked with the ACLU on that. I got the first phone calls, and I said, "This stinks, but I can't do this. I can't do this on my own." Called the ACLU. They were completely receptive, and just thank heavens for the ACLU for being there.
and they have, not only the local resources, but the national resources. And so it brought that in, and I think it has had a tremendous deterrent effect we haven't heard of those cases happening again. But it doesn't mean that they won't again. And so the lesson that we're all kind of statewide as immigration attorneys and advocates and working with immigrant communities is, if something seems out of order, we need to know about this, and we need to investigate it and see what, because there are a lot of rumors going around too that aren't true. So we need to try to vet out what's real, what's not real. We don't want to send fear.
Absolutely,
if fear is unwarranted, and that's hard during this time. But we need to communicate. We're doing that. We're doing that well.
Good. This question, okay, like the police, for instance, don't know. I mean, their limits, their jurisdiction, etc. So why is it one might, it's a rhetorical question. Why is it that these guys do this, and then knowing that it is illegal and unconstitutional and all of that. So that's one thing for us to think about in terms of like trying to resist that kind of thing. But also recently, or even before that, say on Maui or Big Island or on Oahu, do you have some experiences along the lines that Clare was talking about from the people you know?
Of living in fear? Or
living in fear and having these kinds of problems happen to them, like being detained or stopped on a checkpoint or whatever.
Fortunately, none of the students that I interact with through my club have faced that. But I know that their families are facing that back on the continent. And so here, for the most part, the students that are a part of UH can fly under the radar. They tend to stick close to campus. Most of them live on campus and sort of don't venture off too far. Part of that, though, I think, is that they are self-secluding themselves because they have family members.
They're self-policing.
Yes.
And that's a problem, right?
So they would rather do that than put themselves at risk. And one of the hardest things for me as the president of this club is, if one of my members is detained, if something happens to them, I am so far removed from their family. What can the rest of us as members do to try to support this individual with such an important emergency?
And that's where safety planning gets into, and that's what a lot of education's being done as far as know your rights, and the ACLU is at the forefront of that, the Hawaii Coalition for Immigration Reform. There's also a new fabulous group that's formed, the Hawaii Coalition for Civil Rights, which has brought together, Filipino groups, Japanese groups, a really fabulous coalition of groups, and we need to have, just as kind of domestic violence safety planning. What are you going to do? Who are you going to call? You have to, prepare for the worst case scenario. Immigrant families have to do that too. Setting up power of attorneys. If dad doesn't come home, what's going to happen to the kids? Memorizing phone numbers and not just keeping everything.
It's a concerted effort, and all people come into that in a huge coalition. But the other thing I want to ask about, like, okay, you heard about Hawaii, like, as a sanctuary space or state, but space maybe. So what would it take for that to happen, Eréndira, in your judgment, since you are involved? And there might be a lot of people who are against it for one reason or another, good or bad reason. But, I heard something, it's not good to have like Hawaii as a sanctuary space, Why? Well, we have a lot of all places, Marshallese. So Marshallese become immigrants, you know what I'm saying? Which is, terrible. I mean, this is a different status. I mean, you don't mix them up with that. But these guys don't know. You see, that's why I'm saying good or bad reason. And I don't think there's any good reason for Hawaii not becoming a sanctuary space. So you want to say something, and then we can.
I don't think there's any good reason for it not to be a sanctuary space either. One of the things that I'm focusing on, though, is not looking at state or even city level, but just trying to get UH to be a sanctuary space.
Well, we start from there. Yeah.
Sure. So it's really about creating sanctuary, not just for issues that pertain to immigrant populations or refugee populations, but shouldn't the university have a role in being a safe space and a part of this community that is a safe space, a larger community, right? Not just the Valley of Manoa, not just students, faculty, and staff that are a part of this institution, but what role does higher education play within our communities?
Absolutely.
And then hopefully that can lead to some sort of collaboration and trying to get sanctuary to a larger level, city level, state level.
Right. There's some good, some important discussions going on. It's interesting that I think there are 3 states nationwide that have kind of declared statewide policy. And again, there is no set definition of what sanctuary means. It just means that an area has taken has agreed to limitation of powers of what they will do to collaborate with immigration and customs enforcement. So it doesn't mean that you can do really bad things and you're safe, right? It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that, say, local law enforcement won't be deputized to conduct immigration enforcement. That if you're stopped for say a traffic violation, you're not going to end up at the federal detention center because you lack legal documentation. So it does set, and of course those lines that these cities and states and counties are setting up is really kind of, I don't want to say a middle finger to the Trump administration, but kind of like that, like, no, we're not going to go along with your agenda. Screw that. This is what we're going to do for our communities. And there's been all these studies also shown that many police officers are really opposed to playing an immigration enforcement role because they want to be trusted in their community. And you've seen in areas where police have been deputized to conduct immigration enforcement that people aren't reporting domestic violence anymore. People aren't reporting a lot of crimes because they're afraid of going to the police if their status or the status of someone in their home. It drives people further underground. And as far as community policing and law enforcement, that's absolutely exactly. And I think more progressive minds have recognized that. So anything that we can do in Hawaii to really just, I think, advance the message that that we're not setting ourselves up as an us versus them. We're all in this together. We're not going to use our limited resources and funds, and we don't see it our place to conduct immigration enforcement is really, really important. And I think we're going in that direction. Churches are always also talking about sanctuary.
We have experience with that with the churches from the 80s, also Latin American.
And they're talking about it again. And there are people on the continent who have sought refuge in churches. There are a couple pretty high-profile cases, and we're looking at, should that be necessary here? Where would people?
There would be some. I can tell you like 2-3 names of churches, but I don't want to say them now. But one is very close to here, right?
I know the one that you're speaking about, and I'm not sure if they've actually declared or if it's just it's. I mean, churches need to. It's a process that a community needs to. You don't just the next day declare yourself generally.
You have to
understand what that means, the legal ramifications.
Yes, absolutely.
But I can see that definitely happening, and we have some clergy, especially through the Hawaii Coalition for Immigration Reform and FACE, who are very, very supportive of immigrants and immigrant rights, and will put themselves on the line for others.
Yeah, so these things are, very important. But also, like, in terms of the UH, I know, like, the president and the chancellor for Manoa, they wrote something about, like, it's safe space and this and that. But is that enough from your perspective? And what else might, or he should do, or he could do, or, you expect him to do?
Yes, I expect him to do. I was actually part of this group, the Immigrant Refugee Action Coalition, that put pressure on President Lasner to even send out that message in the first place. Because a lot of other university systems across the continent were speaking up and making statements, and we had heard nothing from our president here. And so a group of us got together, started discussing the issue, started circulating a petition, sent it to him, and made it very clear that we as a community, as part of the system, think that you need to speak out and explicitly state your intention about making this a welcoming space for all students. When he did that, we were glad that he did. He does seem to be on the right side of the issue, but we went to him and we said, I think you have a priority and a responsibility to not only saying that this should be the case, but what mechanisms can we put in place in order to ensure that this safe space is for all?
And in fact, if I may interject, this also started with the Black Lives Matter thing, because when after like Trump just got elected, I think, or a little bit before, they had like black, like written graffiti, Black Lives Don't Matter, for instance, or somebody, like some students walking down University Avenue, and then they tell them, and they were speaking Turkish, by the way, and the other guys didn't know what the hell they were speaking, right? They were white, white guys. Speak English, or something like that, or go home, or something like that. And they're UH students in the political science department, anyway. So these are things that are happening right now. So you have to be like proactive and not, because Eréndira asked me to do that with a pressure group. Okay, I'm writing a letter or something like that. But I mean, these are very important situations. So what do you expect now? I mean, in terms of the resistance.
The movement is strong. I had a case where a client was facing possible detention and deportation, and within a very short period of time, a coalition of people came out to support her at the ICE office, support her and her family, including her 15-year-old son. People are. There's almost like a rapid response network. If we need bodies and souls, and they will come. And there were people who I said, I don't know how long this is going to take. And one woman said, I've got a flashlight on my phone. I can stay here all night if I need to. So people are energized and looking for ways of getting involved in something. And this is really. Kind of a human-to-human movement. I mean, you see the power of collective action. So I think we're going to keep working on multiple levels, and I think one of the levels that we all need to work on is just, conversation by conversation. If you hear something, call it out. Call it out in a way that's going to encourage dialogue and not cut that dialogue. But we need to just person by person, I think, try to change hearts and minds.
Yeah, we have 1 minute. I want to say something and then go to you, Eréndira. People who are against immigration and this and that, they are fighting against themselves, actually, in multiple ways. One is making the society unstable, and then rather than targeting the people who made their lives miserable, they are getting like scapegoats, So any more on that or anything else you want to finish up with, because we have less than about 30 seconds left.
Yeah, I think that scapegoating hurts everyone. And if anything, at the core of each of our beings is that we want to be happy and healthy, not only for ourselves, but for our families. And so if each of us dedicate ourselves to trying to be happy and healthy for ourselves and for our families and for our neighbors, and we focus on that, hopefully we can reach a place in society where we no longer need to scapegoat. The issue won't be, you are the cause of my problems. The issue is then, how can you and I come together to create better and safe spaces?
Wonderful. We're flat out of time. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you.
Talking that, it's great, and we should do more, maybe like in the fall, because this is the last, program for this semester.
There will be plenty more to talk about.
In September.
Plenty more to talk about.
So, because in the summer it will be like repeats of other programs that we have. Thank you very much. Mahalo nui loa. Aloha.
Aloha.
you.